It started on a morning that felt perfectly normal. Sun rising over the farm, mist curling between the rows of corn, chickens clucking their usual complaints. I was sipping my coffee, watching the sunlight hit the barn roof just right, and thinking about nothing at all until I saw it. A white truck creeping slowly down the dirt path that led to my property. At first, I assumed a neighbor had lost their way. It happens sometimes out here in the middle of nowhere. But then I noticed the person behind the wheel, and I froze. It was Karen from the HOA. And if you don't know how to picture a Karen, imagine someone who treats every lawn like it's a federal crime scene, whose idea of a vacation is inspecting someone else's mailbox. She was wearing her usual pink tracksuit, clipboard balanced on her knee, scanning the property like she was expecting to catch me hiding a secret treasure chest, or maybe just a rogue cow. I set my coffee down and walked to the edge of the yard, trying to keep my voice calm. "Karen," I said, "this is private property, you can't just drive onto it." She glanced at me, smiled politely, but with that unmistakable glint that said, "I'm about to argue about the exact angle your garden gnome is facing." "Oh, don't worry," she said. "I'm just here to do a little routine check. Make sure everything is up to HOA standards." I raised an eyebrow. Routine check? On my farm? There wasn't a single HOA rule about cows or tractors or chickens, or the pile of hay that I'd literally built because I liked the smell of it in the morning. "I warned you last week," I said, keeping my voice calm, though my hands were tightening into fists. "Next time, this will be more than a polite conversation." Her smile didn't falter. In fact, I could swear it got sharper. "Oh, I'm sure we'll come to some sort of understanding." And with that, she drove on, slowly, painfully slow, like she was savoring every inch of intrusion. After she left, I walked down to the spot where the truck had passed. Footprints in the mud, marks on my gate, the gate I had built myself, strong enough to survive a tornado, and I realized this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I started noticing little things. A wheel mark near my vegetable garden, the gate slightly ajar when I'd left it latched, even the dog seemed on edge, growling at shadows that weren't there. It was subtle, but I knew it wasn't accidental. Karen and her HOA patrol were testing me, pushing the boundaries, seeing how far they could go before I snapped. And here's the thing about farms, they're supposed to be peaceful. But when someone treats your land like a public park and laughs at your warnings, something inside you shifts. My usual calm, patient self was being replaced by someone sharper, someone ready to defend every inch of dirt, every wooden post, every chicken coop. I spent that evening walking the edges of the property, flashlight in hand, noting every crack in the fence, every possible weak spot. And I smiled, because if Karen thought this was going to intimidate me, she had no idea. The suspense was already building. I could feel it in the quiet air of the farm at night, in the way the shadows seemed to move just a little differently. Karen wasn't going to stop. She was coming back, and next time I wouldn't just be warning her. That's when I knew the real game had begun. After that first encounter, I thought maybe Karen would get the message. Maybe she'd realize this was private property, and that I wasn't some pushover who'd let her waltz around like she owned the place. I was wrong. The next morning, I noticed it, tiny footprints near my vegetable garden. At first, I thought maybe it was just the dog wandering too close, but then I saw the wheel marks on the soft dirt. Someone had driven across my land, leaving tracks like breadcrumbs of trespass. My heart sank. It wasn't just that she had disrespected my warning. It was that she was doing it deliberately, testing me, poking at my patience like a kid poking at a hornet's nest. And Karen, well, she was enjoying it. Over the next week, things escalated in subtle, unnerving ways. The gate I had latched every night was occasionally left ajar. A few of my tools were moved, not stolen, just rearranged. Even my chickens seemed wary, pecking nervously at the ground as if sensing intruders I couldn't always see. I started staying up later, listening for the crunch of tires on dirt, the faint creak of hinges. Every shadow felt like it was moving a little too deliberately. And the thing is, you can't call the cops for a little trespassing if it hasn't caused any real damage, especially when the trespassers are official HOA members who insist they're entitled to be there. I found myself checking the fence lines twice a day, making notes, snapping photos, and recording videos of any suspicious activity. It became a strange rhythm, part vigilance, part paranoia, part amusement at the absurdity of it all. I couldn't help picturing Karen tiptoeing across the fields in her pink tracksuit, clipboard held high, muttering about community standards. And yet I didn't act impulsively. I remembered my first confrontation. I had warned her. I had set boundaries. Now it was time to plan, to watch, to wait for the perfect opportunity to respond. But even as I prepared, the tension kept mounting. There were nights when I swore I saw movement near the barn, shapes slipping between the shadows. Sometimes I'd hear whispers carried by the wind, just faint enough to make me doubt my own sanity. Were the HOA members sneaking around in the dead of night, or was my imagination finally getting the better of me? Neighbors started noticing too. Some would give me sympathetic glances when passing by, muttering about that Karen woman like we all knew the legend. Others avoided me entirely, afraid of crossing the HOA themselves. It was unnerving to realize how much power one self-righteous person could wield over a whole community, simply because she claimed authority. One evening, I decided to take a closer look at the tracks near my garden. I crouched low in the moonlight, flashlight sweeping over the dirt. That's when I saw it, a footprint unmistakably human, fresh and deliberate. My stomach tightened. Whoever had done this was bold, confident, and expecting me not to notice. That was the moment I realized the pattern. It wasn't random. Every small trespass, every rearranged tool, every open gate, it was all part of a testing game. Karen wanted to see how far she could push me before I lost my temper. And I wasn't about to let that happen. I spent the rest of the night walking the property lines, flashlight in one hand, coffee mug in the other, feeling a mixture of anger, anticipation, and something darker, a thrill that comes from knowing the next move is mine to make. The farm was no longer just a place of peace, it had become a chessboard, and I was already thinking 3 steps ahead. By the time dawn broke, I knew one thing for certain: Karen and her HOA crew weren't going to stop, but neither was I. They had crossed the line, and the next time they came, I wouldn't just watch, I would be ready. And that's when I began laying the groundwork for a plan that would make them regret ever setting foot on my land. By the 3rd week, it was clear. Karen and her HOA weren't just testing boundaries, they were deliberately pushing every limit I had. Footprints, wheel marks, open gates, tools moved, fences inspected without permission. It was all part of some unspoken game, and in their minds, they were winning. But here's the thing about me: I don't get rattled easily. I'm patient, I think ahead. And I've always believed that the best defense isn't just confrontation, it's preparation. So I decided it was time to stop waiting for them to make mistakes and start shaping the board myself. I began with a survey of the farm. Every gate, every fence post, every possible path the HOA could take, I examined it all. I took notes, drew crude maps, and started imagining scenarios. It wasn't just about stopping them physically, it was about sending a message without escalating into something I could regret. I set up a few subtle security measures, motion-sensitive lights that wouldn't alert them immediately but would let me know someone was on the property. Cameras hidden in plain sight, disguised as birdhouses or weathered tools. And I laid down small deterrents, harmless but enough to make the uninvited visitors hesitate. Humor kept creeping in. I'd imagine Karen tiptoeing through my cornfields in her pink tracksuit, trying not to step on a sprinkler, muttering about community standards under her breath. The image was so absurd I had to laugh quietly to myself, even as the tension built. The suspense, though, wasn't just in planning. It was in the waiting. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow near the barn, every unexpected creak of the gate set my nerves on edge. I couldn't help but wonder, would they come tonight, or would they wait for another day, thinking they were clever? Neighbors became unintentional allies. Some offered quiet advice, sharing rumors about Karen's past raids on other properties. Others simply gave me wary looks when I mentioned my frustrations, silently acknowledging that I was not the only one fed up with her behavior. I knew one thing for certain: the next encounter wouldn't be casual. It wouldn't be a warning. It would be the first step in showing them that while they could trespass, they couldn't do it without consequences. So I planned meticulously. Every possible route Karen and her HOA might take was considered. Every weakness in the fences, gates, and driveway noted. Every camera and motion sensor positioned with precision. And I started small, testing minor traps that were more psychological than physical: sprinklers that would activate unexpectedly, lights that would flicker, sounds of animals moving in unusual ways. The suspense was almost unbearable at times. Each evening, I'd sit in the farmhouse, listening for the faint hum of a vehicle engine, waiting for a shadow to pass my windows. Every little noise made me jump, but it also sharpened my focus. Every second of tension was a reminder I was ready for them, and when the time came, they wouldn't know what hit them. There was also a strange thrill to all of it. It's not every day that you get to outsmart an entire HOA, and I could feel the anticipation building inside me. I wasn't acting out of malice, just a need to protect what was mine. And yet, even in my planning, I couldn't suppress a tiny grin at the thought of Karen stepping into one of my harmless surprises. By the time the 3rd week ended, I had laid the groundwork for something bigger, something satisfying, something that would make Karen regret underestimating me. And then one night, as the moon rose high over the farm and the wind whispered through the trees, I saw it, the familiar silhouette of the HOA truck creeping down the dirt path. I gripped my flashlight, took a deep breath, and smiled. The first move had been made, and now the real game was about to begin. The night had been quiet for hours. The wind rustled the cornfields just enough to sound like footsteps, but nothing concrete. I was perched on the porch, coffee in one hand, flashlight in the other, ears straining for any sound. And then I heard it, the low rumble of an engine. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that sound anywhere. Karen's white HOA truck, slowly, deliberately creeping down my dirt driveway like a predator testing the waters. I crouched, barely breathing, as the truck rolled closer. This time I was ready. I had spent the past week setting small traps, not dangerous, just clever little annoyances that would teach them a lesson. Mud patches, motion-activated sprinklers, and strategically placed branches that would brush against the truck, making it impossible to ignore the farm was mine. The truck hit the first patch of mud. The tires sank slightly, but they kept going. I held my breath. The second patch, and the wheels spun, stuck just enough to make the driver pause. I could hear Karen muttering under her breath, something about stupid farm owners and out-of-control property. I stayed hidden, watching as she fumbled with the gear shift, trying to get unstuck. The headlights swept over my fences, over the tools I had lined up, over the motion sensors now quietly recording everything. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and adrenaline. Finally, they were experiencing the consequences of their trespassing. It wasn't just about the mud or the minor obstacles. It was about sending a message. I wanted Karen and her HOA team to realize that this farm wasn't just land on a map. It was my home, my sanctuary, and no amount of authority could make me back down. And the humor, oh, it was impossible to resist. I imagined Karen stepping out, her pink tracksuit splattered with mud, her perfect hair ruined, and her clipboard trembling in her hands. I almost laughed out loud, but I forced myself to stay silent. This wasn't a comedy show yet. Finally, after several minutes of struggling, Karen gave up. She muttered something about returning with reinforcements and started backing the truck toward the road. I could see the frustration etched on her face, anger, embarrassment, disbelief. She hadn't expected resistance. She hadn't expected cleverness. The suspense didn't end there. As she drove away, I realized something important. This was only the beginning. Karen would regroup, plan, and return. She always did, and when she did, I needed to be ready for the next move. That night, I checked the cameras and reviewed the footage. Every wheel mark, every glance of confusion, every frustrated gesture was captured. This was proof, documentation that could be used later if needed. But more than that, it was a personal victory, a small taste of justice in a situation where the HOA thought they were untouchable. I couldn't help but smile, imagining the conversation she'd have back at the HOA office. The panic, the anger, the way she would try to convince herself that this was just a fluke. Meanwhile, I was calm, prepared, and several steps ahead. As I walked back to the farmhouse, flashlight sweeping over the fields, I knew one thing: Karen's arrogance had given me the upper hand. She thought she could intimidate me with rules and authority, but I had something stronger: patience, preparation, and the ability to think one step ahead. By the time I reached the porch, the farm was quiet again. The moon reflected off the barn roof, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a sense of triumph. For the first time, I felt a real sense of control in this escalating war. But deep down, I knew I couldn't celebrate for long. Karen would be back, she always came back, and when she did, the stakes would be higher. That night, I made a mental note. This was my land, my rules, and next time the HOA wouldn't just be inconvenienced. They'd realize in no uncertain terms that crossing me had consequences. The game had begun in earnest, and I was ready for every move they thought they could make. I thought the first trap would be enough to slow them down. I was wrong. Karen wasn't the type to quietly accept defeat. In fact, she escalated, calling for a formal HOA meeting, claiming that I had violated community rules and needed to be held accountable. When I received the notice, I felt a mix of frustration and grim satisfaction. This was exactly what I had been waiting for, a public showdown. The farm was mine, and now the world would see exactly what I had been dealing with. The day of the meeting arrived, and I drove down to the community center with a folder full of evidence. Photos of wheel tracks, video footage of trespassing, detailed notes of the dates and times. I wasn't nervous, but I was alert. Every glance from Karen and her minions felt like a challenge. From the moment I stepped in, the tension was palpable. Karen was there, as expected, in her pink blazer this time, clipboard in hand, acting like a general about to deliver orders. She was flanked by a few other board members who looked equally confident, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. The meeting started. Karen launched into her speech, full of dramatic flair, pointing fingers and quoting obscure HOA clauses. I listened quietly, letting her words roll over me, knowing that the evidence I had collected was going to speak louder than her theatrics. When my turn came, I calmly laid out my case. I walked them through every incident: the truck on my land, the moved tools, the open gates. I showed timestamps, video clips, and clear documentation of trespassing. My voice was steady, but I could feel the room shift. Whispers began, and eyes darted between Karen and me. Karen's confident smirk faltered for a moment. She tried to interrupt, tried to argue, but each attempt was met with proof that she had been on my property without permission. The tension in the room was thick, almost tangible, as the reality of her actions settled in. There was humor too, in a quiet, satisfying way. I could see her flustered attempts to maintain authority, hands shaking slightly, muttering about procedures that didn't apply here. The other board members started exchanging glances, unsure whether to side with her or acknowledge the truth. The suspense reached its peak when she finally realized that she couldn't win this argument. Her face flushed, her voice wavered, and the once confident tone of command disappeared. I held the room's attention, knowing that the balance had shifted. The power she had wielded over me for weeks was gone, replaced by something far more potent: undeniable proof and calm confidence. And then she did something I didn't expect. She stormed out. The meeting room was left in stunned silence, and I could hear her muttering threats over her shoulder about "this isn't over and you'll regret this." But it didn't shake me, not one bit. As the room settled, a few neighbors quietly thanked me, their expressions a mix of admiration and relief. Some had feared standing up to Karen themselves, but now they saw that it was possible. I had taken the first step in not just defending my property, but reclaiming my peace. Walking out of the community center, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The tension wasn't gone. Karen would come back, that much I knew. She was too stubborn to simply let it go. But I had made my point publicly, convincingly, and with the upper hand. That night, back on my farm, I looked over the fields, the fences, and the barn. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the memory of the confrontation. The battle wasn't over, but the first real victory had been mine. And I knew deep down that the next move would require even more preparation, more cunning. Karen wouldn't give up, and neither could I. The stage was set for the next chapter, one where the stakes would rise and the suspense would be even more intense. After the HOA meeting, I thought the tension might ease. That was wishful thinking. Karen doesn't quit. She sulks, schemes, and plots, but she doesn't quit. And I knew that if I wanted true peace on my farm, I had to escalate, legally, officially, unstoppably. I spent the next few days gathering every shred of evidence I had. Photographs of tire marks, timestamps from the security cameras, notes detailing each instance of trespassing. Every small intrusion became a piece of a larger puzzle, and I was determined to assemble it perfectly. I filed formal complaints with the HOA, documenting not just the trespassing but the harassment. Then I contacted my attorney, who was more amused than alarmed by the situation, and we discussed sending a strongly worded notice, one that made it clear that any further intrusion would have serious consequences. The suspense was immediate. I could feel the tension mounting every time I drove past the farm gates. Would Karen push back? Would she attempt another friendly visit? She hadn't yet, but I knew her ego wouldn't allow her to quietly accept defeat. Then came the letters, official-looking notices from the HOA, attempting to justify past trespasses and warn of potential community repercussions if I didn't comply with arbitrary rules. I read them with a grin. Their arrogance was astounding, and their lack of understanding of property law was even more satisfying. I responded calmly, legally, and firmly. Copies of all communications went straight into my files. Each letter I sent added another layer of suspense. I knew Karen would see them, that she would fume, that she would plot her next move, and I relished the thought. Neighbors began noticing the subtle shift. Some would peek through their windows as I walked the property, noticing the security cameras, the motion sensors, the subtle signs that the farm was more prepared than ever. I caught whispers of admiration, little nods of solidarity. Even the most cautious neighbors seemed to recognize that I was serious. The suspense wasn't just external, it was internal too. Every creak of the gate, every shadow near the barn, every distant rumble in the driveway kept me on alert. I had taken the legal high ground, yes, but I knew Karen wouldn't stop. She would try, as always, to push boundaries. I had to be ready. Then one night it happened. A call late in the evening, a voice whispering threats and vague promises about next time it'll be worse. My blood ran cold for a moment, but I quickly reminded myself I had planned for this. I had prepared for the worst, and legally I was untouchable. I checked the cameras one more time that night. There it was, a shadow near the gate, moving cautiously as if testing the waters. I didn't panic, I smiled. Karen was back, probably expecting to intimidate me, only to walk right into a situation she didn't fully understand. I spent the next few hours monitoring, documenting, and ensuring every move was recorded. It was almost like a chess match. I was several steps ahead and she was moving blindly. I could almost hear her muttering about how he got lucky, unaware that it wasn't luck, it was patience, preparation, and precision. The suspense in the neighborhood was palpable too. Word spread that the farm was off-limits and heavily monitored, and I could sense Karen's frustration simmering beneath the surface. She was clever, but she underestimated one thing. I was cleverer, calmer, and more prepared than she had ever imagined. By the time dawn broke, I leaned against the porch railing, sipping my coffee, watching the morning mist curl over the fields. The legal strike had worked. The HOA was officially on notice. Trespassing was no longer a harmless game, it had consequences, and Karen now knew it. Yet deep down, I knew the story wasn't over. Karen never gives up easily, and the next move would be her boldest yet. The suspense was far from over, it was only building, like a storm waiting to hit, and when it did, I would be ready as always. Because one thing had become clear, my farm, my rules, my land, and no HOA or Karen was going to change that. Just when I thought the legal notices and careful monitoring might finally make Karen back off, the universe decided to throw me a curveball. It was a calm evening, the kind of quiet that makes the shadows stretch long across the fields, when I noticed movement in the distance, a familiar silhouette creeping along the edge of the property. Karen. But this time she wasn't alone. A small group of HOA members followed, walking cautiously as if they were trying to sneak in without being seen. They were confident, maybe overconfident, thinking that the farm was vulnerable, that the rules and cameras couldn't touch them if they were careful. I felt a thrill of tension run through me. This wasn't just trespassing anymore, it was bold, almost daring, and I had been waiting for this moment. Weeks of planning, weeks of preparation led to this night. Every camera, every motion sensor, every harmless deterrent had been set with precision. Sprinklers hidden behind the trees, branches strategically placed, subtle obstacles that would disorient anyone moving through the property. And I watched from my vantage point, silent, ready. As they entered the farm, I activated the first surprise. A sprinkler near the driveway hissed to life, sending a fine spray of water directly into the path of the intruders. Karen shrieked, stepping back, her meticulously planned entrance already unraveling. The other members slipped slightly on the wet ground, scrambling to maintain balance. The suspense escalated as I watched them navigate the field, unsure which steps were safe. Every branch I had positioned for harmless obstruction now nudged, tapped, or brushed them in ways that caused confusion and minor chaos. Shadows danced in the light of my security lamps, adding a surreal, almost cinematic feel to the unfolding scene. And Karen, she was losing control. Her confident smirk was gone, replaced with flustered gestures and muttered threats. Every attempt to regain composure only made the situation more chaotic. I could hear her trying to whisper orders to the others, but the night swallowed her words, leaving them directionless. Neighbors would have called it a comedy if they weren't secretly relieved. A self-appointed enforcer and her entourage scrambling across someone else's land while the rightful owner watched from a distance, unseen and untouchable. I couldn't help a quiet laugh at the absurdity of it all, but it was satisfying too. This was a lesson being delivered in a way that couldn't be ignored. The HOA members were frantic now, trying to retrace their steps, but every path seemed to lead to another minor obstacle I had set. Sprinklers hissed, cameras flashed, and branches blocked passage. They were trapped in a maze of my creation, confusion mounting with every move. And then the final twist. Karen pulled out her phone, whispering something about emergency action and calling an attorney. I smiled, knowing it was too late. Every step they took was recorded, every misstep documented. The legal shield I had built was stronger than anything she could muster in a panicked call. By the time they finally stumbled back toward the edge of the property, soaked, flustered, and humiliated, the suspense had reached its peak. Karen's plans, her threats, her arrogance, all had collapsed under the weight of preparation, patience, and strategy. I remained hidden, watching, savoring the culmination of weeks of tension. The storm of trespassing had passed for now, but one thing was clear: Karen would return, scheming, plotting, and perhaps even escalating further, and when she did, I would be ready. The night ended with the quiet hum of the sprinklers shutting off. the silhouettes of the intruders disappearing down the driveway and me standing alone in the field, triumphant yet wary. The twist had been unexpected, the chaos palpable, and the suspense unforgettable. Because on this farm, I had learned one undeniable truth. Patience, planning, and a little creativity could turn even the boldest trespassers into pawns in a game they didn't realize they were playing. And Karen had just played her last move, at least for tonight. The morning after the chaos, the farm was quiet, almost eerily so. The fields shimmered with dew, the chickens clucked in contented oblivion, and the sun rose slowly over the horizon. For the first time in weeks, I felt a deep sense of calm, but I knew better than to think the battle was completely over. Karen and her HOA had retreated, flustered and humiliated. The sprinklers, the mud, the carefully placed obstacles, they had all done their work. I had proof of every trespass, every misstep, and every attempt to intimidate me. Legally, I was untouchable. And the best part, I could finally enjoy a quiet morning without worrying if the next truck on my dirt path was filled with intruders. I walked the property, my boots crunching softly against the earth, and couldn't help but smile. Every fence post, every patch of crops, every small corner of my farm was safe again, not because Karen had suddenly learned manners, but because I had taken control. I had prepared, anticipated, and executed a plan that proved one undeniable truth: trespassers don't get to dictate the rules. Neighbors began to notice the change, their cautious glances replaced with subtle nods of admiration. A few whispered quietly about how the farm was off-limits now and how Karen had clearly learned her lesson. Some even admitted they had been secretly rooting for me all along, afraid of Karen's wrath but glad to see someone finally stand up to her. There was humor in the aftermath too. I imagined Karen at the HOA office, mud on her shoes, wet from the sprinklers, trying to write angry reports while muttering under her breath. I could almost hear her stammering explanations to board members about unexpected obstacles and the farmer's cunning. It was absurd and satisfying in equal measure. Of course, the suspense wasn't entirely gone. I knew Karen might try again someday, her stubbornness was legendary, but this time the game had changed. I wasn't just reacting, I was in control. Every inch of the farm was monitored, documented, and prepared for any uninvited guest. Karen had learned one way or another that I wouldn't be intimidated. The final act of the story wasn't about punishment, it was about reclaiming my peace. I installed a few permanent security measures, subtle but effective, and made small adjustments to the landscape so that the farm could defend itself without my constant intervention. I walked the fields, checking the fences, tightening the locks, and just enjoying the quiet. And in that quiet, I realized something else. There's a strange satisfaction in knowing that standing your ground, calmly and cleverly, can create real change. Karen had tested me, challenged me, and tried to make my life difficult, but by staying patient, planning strategically, and taking measured action, I had turned the tables completely. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned on the porch railing, looking over the farm. The sun warmed my face, the wind rustled through the corn, and the world felt right again. I knew the story of the HOA, the trespassing, and Karen's antics would be remembered, not as a tale of conflict, but as proof that perseverance and clever thinking pay off. Humor lingered in my mind too. I could imagine writing a book someday, How to Handle Karen Without Losing Your Sanity, a farmer's guide to standing up to the HOA, maybe even a movie. The thought made me chuckle quietly to myself, alone on the porch, savoring the victory that was part justice, part cunning, and entirely satisfying. By midday, life returned to normal on the farm. The chickens scratched, the cows grazed, and I walked through the fields with a sense of pride and calm. Karen and her crew were out of sight, the HOA had learned their lesson, and my land, my sanctuary, was once again mine. I knew one thing for certain: any future trespassers would think twice. They'd see the fences, the cameras, the evidence of past missteps, and know that this wasn't a farm to be trifled with. And if Karen ever tried again, I would be ready, always ready. Because in the end, standing up for what's yours isn't just about confrontation. It's about strategy, patience, and knowing when to strike. And now my farm was safe, my peace restored, and my story complete. The sun set over the fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could finally breathe. The battle was over, the suspense resolved, and justice, sweet, satisfying, and well-earned, had been served. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.